Did liberals ruin this country? Okay, fine, neoliberals. We're going to discuss. Thom Hartmann's here. He's the host of Thom Hartmann Program, of course, and he's the author of the new book, The Hidden History of Neoliberalism. So, Thom, welcome, and tell people what neoliberal is, because I don't think that everybody knows, and sometimes people get confused by it.
Yeah. Hey, Jen, thanks so much for having me back on. Neoliberalism was a political and economic philosophy that came out of a group of economists in Europe. In Europe, liberal economics is what here in America we would refer to as conservative economics or even libertarian economics, small government. And so neoliberalism was the new liberalism. They met in the 30s and 40s originally in Paris and then later in Switzerland. Mont Pelerin, after which the society is named. And we're trying to come up with a strategy to harden democracies, European countries, so that they would never again flip into communism or fascism. It hasn't quite worked out that way, but that was their idea.
Yeah. And so how did it go astray?
Well, it was based on a phony baloney premise. I mean, it was a group of economists, and so this is kind of Abe Maslow's old saying, when the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. They assumed that economics was the key to everything, and so the primary assumption of neoliberalism, which we know in America as Reaganism or trickle-down economics or supply-side economics, the primary argument was that there's 1 billion decisions being made in the marketplace every single second. Right now, as we're speaking, there's probably 1,000 people trying to decide which brand of orange juice to buy. And as a consequence of that, the market has so much data, so much intelligence, so much information that no bureaucrat or government official could ever match it. And therefore, the marketplace should be setting the rules for itself and for government, which is kind of crazy when you think about it. It's like saying that, whichever football team wins the most games gets to decide, next year how many players it has on the field. It's like, oh, yeah, let's throw away the rule makers, in this case, government. So there's a couple of main pieces to it. The first is deregulation. Anything that interferes with the so-called magic marketplace, the free market, has to be done away with. So deregulate all government protections. Milton Friedman, in one of his books, even argues that we shouldn't license doctors. Another is get rid of labor unions. Labor unions are another interference in the free market, the proper functioning of the free market. Free trade is the extension of that, global free trade. Corporations should be free to go anywhere in the world to get the cheapest labor they can find. And, it's all good. End the social safety net, no more Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, food stamps, close all the public schools. Anything that is basically the government's doing, they view as a distortion of the marketplace. Privatize everything. And of course, because the biggest corporations and the richest billionaires have proven through the Darwinian process of getting that rich, that they are the brilliant, perfect people to run the marketplace, you want to eliminate taxes on them. And that's why, the average billionaire in America is paying around a 3% income tax, and the average corporation in America is paying nothing.
So, Thom, there's parts of this that I don't know if we're going to even disagree on, but and I want to get there. But there's two things I need to explain first to the audience, guys. I think that we underestimate how confusing the word neoliberal is. As Thom just explained to you, it actually means conservative economics, okay, as we know it here in America. It's like in Sweden, the Social Democrats are the left-wing party. The Sweden Democrats are the right-wing party. It is very confusing, so we wanted to explain that. Okay, now, Thom, I want to focus on the two things you said there and split them up, because there's actually two different things that you just talked about. One is the market is going to be really good at setting a price, for example, and different parts of determining factors in the economy, right? And the second part is, and that's why we shouldn't regulate it. But wait a minute, those two things are not at all logically connected. It is possible that the market could be excellent at setting a price, but it doesn't mean it doesn't need regulation. It does. In fact, even Adam Smith talked about that, and he's the ideological godfather of capitalism. And he said, no, you need regulations, otherwise capitalism won't work.
Yeah, we're saying the same thing, Jenk. You're absolutely right. And I was characterizing the premise of neoliberalism, which is that there shouldn't be any regulation. It should be laissez-faire capitalism, unregulated capitalism. And one of the things that we know is that unregulated capitalism does have a resting state. It does have a normal state. It's been, Europe was run this way for 1,000 years. Charles Dickens wrote, Christmas Carol is a story that everybody's familiar with. That's the world you end up with unregulated or neoliberal capitalism. You end up with, the top 1% who don't even appear in most of Dickens's books. They don't even appear in Christmas Carol. That's the royal family and the big land and factory owners. Then you have a very small middle class, typically 3 to 5%. That's about the maximum size you get in a completely unregulated capitalist society. And that was Scrooge and Marley. They were small businessmen. They ran a little 2-employee company. And then you've got the 95% who are the working poor, and most of them are in debt throughout their whole entire lives. That's the state that capitalism will always drift back to, lacking regulation. So if you want to have a middle class, like the one that Franklin Roosevelt created in the United States, first time in the history of the world that it was over 50% of the citizens were in the middle class, you've got to change the rules of the game. It's just like the NFL. They want to have football be really exciting. So whichever team does the worst this year gets the first draft pick next year. You change the rules, or you set up the rules of the game so it works for everybody. And, unregulated capitalism doesn't work for everybody. It works for whoever has the most capital.
Yeah, so on this, Tom and I are talking about the same exact thing. So unregulated capitalism, neoliberalism is one way of putting it. The other way of putting it was what I call corporatism, right?
Yeah.
And corporatism actually is not in favor of capitalism. Corporatism wants to end competition. Capitalism is about competition. And so, and Tom, your sports analogy is perfect, because if you don't, regulation is the equivalent of referees in sports. And if you don't have refs, you can't have a game, because everybody will break each other's jaw and then we'll be done, right?
That's right.
And that's exactly what's happening in this corporatist world. And to your point about the 3% and the 1% and the rest of us, that's pretty much where we are now in America. We've got the top 1%, and then I would say the top 10% that are doing okay, and then 90% of us are in debt, can't recover from any kind of economic blow, et cetera. So we're almost at and then that's why they call it late stage capitalism, right? But now I do want to challenge you on one thing. So, like, for example, you have as your some of your top descriptions of neoliberalism: free trade, financial austerity, and deregulation. So deregulation is in essence what we've just been talking about, this entire thing. Financial austerity, again, is very similar. That's putting all the costs on the middle class and the poor and letting the rich skate. But free trade, on the other hand, I think can work if we had a regulated economy. So is that a fair distinction?
It is. And in fact, that's the call, one of the major calls to action of my book. In 1791, when George Washington was president, he wanted to, America was a largely agricultural country at the time. More than 90% of the people who worked were farmers. And he wanted to build an industrial nation. So he turned to Alexander Hamilton and said, how do we do this? And so Hamilton looked at how the UK had done that, and it had done it based on a program that King Henry VII had started called the Tudor Plan, which had lifted England from being, mud roads and mud huts into being a major industrial power. And so Hamilton rolled this thing out in 1793. It was called initially it was called his Report on Manufactures, but it was Hamilton's 11-point plan. He referred to it as the American plan. And he said, we have to engage in trade with the world, but we do it on our terms. We make it easy to export manufactured goods from the United States and easy to import raw materials into the United States, but we make it difficult to have foreign manufacturers compete with our manufacturers here. And we do that through tariffs and things like that. So setting rules for trade is a way to build a middle class.
So, Tom, I've always wanted to ask someone that has your breadth of knowledge on this. Look, we did free trade wrong because we let the corporations write the trade agreements, and they wrote it in their favor and against us and Chinese workers, by the way, and Vietnamese workers and all of them. But is there a way that we could have done it right, where the middle class did grow in China without hurting the American worker?
It doesn't have to be a zero-sum game, but and this is one of the really fascinating things that I learned when I was doing the research on this book. The United States adopted neoliberalism in 1981 with Reagan. Russia adopted it in 1991. It was forced on them by the IMF and George Herbert Walker Bush. There was a huge debate in China in the late 80s. I lived in China for a month in November of 86 when this debate was going on. And they were, Mao was dead and the Cultural Revolution was a disaster. And there were these two factions within the Chinese government. One was saying we need to try this neoliberalism thing that America and Russia hadn't started yet, but that America is doing. It didn't work out in Chile, but maybe we can make it work. And the other faction was saying, no, we need to imitate Alexander Hamilton's American plan, and we need to protect Chinese manufacturers and discourage imports of American-made goods, but aggressively promote exports of Chinese goods to America. And which was, the Chinese version of what Hamilton prescribed for America that literally created, this huge industrial power here in the United States. And so the Chinese adopted the American plan, Alexander Hamilton's American plan. And we adopted neoliberalism, which put us at a huge disadvantage and put them at a substantial, big advantage. And that's how it worked out and why it worked out. If either of us were operating the exact same program, if they had adopted neoliberalism and us, or if we had held on to the Hamilton plan, then probably there would have been a slower growth of China and less rapid destruction of the American middle class. But since then, we've seen 60,000 factories close in the United States, 15 million jobs, according to federal government statistics, go away. And it's gutted the American middle class. We've gone from 65% of us in the middle class when Reagan came into office to, fewer than 45% today.
That's an absolute devastation on the middle class. Look, and history has the answers. That's why books like this are so important. So everybody check out The Hidden History of Neoliberalism. It's by Thom Hartmann, and it is great. So Thom, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
It's always a pleasure. Thanks so much for inviting me, Cenk.